All right. Epicurus felt bound to oppose it, and he laid down his challenge around the close of the 4th century BC with a cosmology whose effects were to reverberate throughout the coming Roman world for many centuries to come. Indeed, it still survives in the elements of several modern philosophies. The challenge issued by Plato's model of origins was met by Epicurus at every point, even on those more mundane matters that had merely to do with the city state and jurisprudence. But in particular, Epicurus argued that it was insufficient to contend for the divine creation of the universe, as Plato did, from the assumption of a well ordered cosmos, simply because the cosmos, in Epicurus's eyes, was not well ordered. It had culminated from a long, perhaps infinite series of accidents resulting from the random jostling of atoms. But then, ever the sophist, Epicurus shrewdly shifted the ground a little so that any rebuttal from the creationist camp would need to take on board an added complication and consequently be more difficult to propound. For, in spite of his unabashed materialism, Epicurus was careful to acknowledge the existence of the gods. He relegated them to a place of complete ineffectuality and disinterest in the cosmos, but he avoided an outright denial of their existence. Apart from the fact that he had to beware of the still standing laws of the time against impiety and blasphemy, Epicurus knew that outright atheism is easily refuted by any philosopher with an eye for controversy, and the fact that few men in any age are outright atheists anyway would ensure scant support for his views. But if the existence of the gods is acknowledged at the same time in which the divine creation of the universe is denied, then the arguments against the Epicurean view becomes infinitely more complex, affording the materialist with the subsequent ability to change ground at will. Such sophistry, of course, was entirely in keeping with the character of Epicurus, who was roundly criticized for it on more than one occasion. Epicurus himself used to do the same thing. For instance, he saw that if those atoms of his were always falling downwards by their own weight, their motion would be fixed and predetermined, and there would be no room for free will in the world. So, casting about for a way to avoid this determinism, which Democritus had apparently overlooked, he said that the atoms, as they fell, just swerved a little. However, the acknowledgement of the existence of the gods did have the virtue of imparting the Epicurus control of the field and the ability to state the terms under which the ensuing controversy was to be fought. Or so he vainly hoped, for far from seeing creationism off the proverbial field, Epicureanism merely served to rally the creationist camp towards a better definition of its views, and the school of thought which raised itself to meet the challenge of Epicurean materialism was the Stoic school founded by Zeno in ca 308 BC. As events were to prove, Stoicism was to become a very effective challenge indeed in the pagan world against materialism in any guise or form, and that challenge was brought about by a most significant development. This development began with a far more profound concept of the creator than had hitherto prevailed in Greek thought, whether that of Hesiod or Xenophans or even Plato. Indeed, the incipient and lightly veiled atheism of Epicurus's philosophy was now answered by the Stoics in the most compelling terms, with Chrysippus giving it perhaps its most persuasive voice. If there is anything in nature which the human mind, which human intelligence, energy, and power could not create, then the creator of such things must be a being superior to man. But the heavenly bodies in their eternal orbits could not be created by man. They must therefore be created by a being greater than man. Only an arrogant fool would imagine that there was nothing in the whole world greater than himself. Therefore, there must be something greater than man, and that something must be God. This may be a good place to briefly reflect upon the somewhat mysterious source of such endearingly plain logic. A plainness of logic, indeed, that is quite uncharacteristic of Greek philosophy. What processes of thought can conceivably have led from the grotesque parodies of human corruption that one sees in the older Hesiodic creation model of the Greeks amongst beings that passed for gods to the majestic and undeniably sublime concept of a supreme and omnipotent deity that was now being voiced by Chrysippus and his colleagues. The Christian faith had yet to be born, its influence on Greek thought still lying some centuries into the future. So, could it perhaps have been through the agency of the recently Hellenized Jews who, albeit they horrified the Orthodox of their faith by mingling much of Judaism with Greek thought and practices, unwittingly carried with them into the Greek camp an inherent knowledge of the God of Genesis in a kind of theological Trojan horse? The answer is no, for apart from the fact that one can hardly claim that Jewish philosophical thought was any less complex or sophistic than that of the Greeks, there are also strong historical and chronological grounds for denying Jewish influence in the sphere of Greek philosophy at this particular point in history. The Greeks, it appears, first made contact with Judaism as early as the year 587 BC, when Greek mercenaries assisted the armies of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in the investing and destruction of Jerusalem. Along with the mercenaries, of course, would have been a smaller army of civil servants, spies, and so on, many of whom, during the long and enforced hours of leisure, doubtless spent their time in philosophical discussion. But to suggest that this would have included the taking on board of Jewish thought is quite beyond the realms of probability. The Jews were invariably viewed with a poorly disguised contempt by the Greeks throughout their centuries of contact with one another, to the extent that many Jews found it politic to become Greek or Hellenized in order to survive at all. The persecution of the Jews under Antiochus IV Epiphanes 175 173 BC, and his determined attempt to expunge the Jewish faith altogether is perhaps the most telling episode regarding the often mutual hostility that existed between the Orthodox of either side. It has to be admitted, of course, that the Jewish Torah, which naturally included the book of Genesis, was translated into Greek in the year 250 BC. Some 17 years before Chrysippus became head of the Stoic school in 233 BC. But even the remarkable translation of Genesis into Greek did not take place until 58 years after the foundation of the Stoic school by Zeno in 308 BC. So clearly, Stoicism as a philosophy owed nothing to the book of Genesis, and the philosophical path that the Stoics trod in order to arrive at their conclusions must therefore remain a mystery to us. However, hold on. Hold that, however. Apart from the new and lofty concept voiced by Xenophanes, Plato, and Chrysippus of the creator of the universe, another concept was to follow, which, in the hands of Chrysippus, I think is how you say it, I don't know, and his colleagues, was to lend the voice of the Stoic school an almost irresistible authority. It was the concept of evidence from design, an argument for that divinely inspired intent and purpose which was observable throughout the universe and which convinced the Stoic, as it convinces the creationists of today, of the scientific and philosophical correctness of his model. Refined and brilliantly expressed by Paley at the beginning of the last century, the importance of evidence from design was not lost on earlier classical theorists who were quick to give it its permanent setting in the idea of creationism. A later Stoic, the Roman Cicero, was to give the concept perhaps its highest expression in pre-Christian times, and his words are worth quoting at a little length. When you see a sundial or a water clock, you see that it tells the time by design and not by chance. How then can you imagine that the universe as a whole is devoid of purpose and intelligence when it embraces everything, including these artifacts themselves and their artificers? Our friend Poseidonus as you know, has recently made a globe which, in its revolution, shows the movements of the sun and stars and planets by day and night just as they appear in the sky. Now, if someone were to take this globe and show it to the people of Britain or Scythia, would a single one of those barbarians fail to see that it was the product of a conscious intelligence? With these beautifully simple words, Cicero gives voice to the idea which even today is the most difficult for the materialist to refute. For it is nigh impossible to explain away convincingly, say, the indescribable complexity of living organisms or even merely parts thereof as the product of blind chance or accident. But Cicero was not just giving voice to one of creationism's most forceful ideas for its own sake. He was doing so by way of refuting the Epicurean notions of Lucretius, the Roman materialist poet and contemporary of his, whose book Cicero mentions in a letter to his brother Quintus in February 54 BC, and which he says was written with many highlights of genius, but with much art. Cicero's own dialogue on the nature of the gods was written some 10 years later in CA 44 BC, specifically as a rebuttal of Lucretius, and it is between Cicero and Lucretius that the controversy rages, with both sides using arguments which are still very familiar to us today. One of those arguments concerned the trustworthiness or otherwise of the senses, which it comes to deducing the validity of evidence from design. How, for example, can we be sure that we interpret that evidence correctly through our senses? This, for the Stoic, was the fatal weakness in the Epicurean argument, which, as Lucretius stated it, runs: the nature of phenomena cannot be understood by the eyes. Lucretius said this not because he believed the eyes themselves to be at fault, but because it was a failing of the mind to perceive things correctly or accurately through the senses. In fairness to Lucretius, he did go on to qualify this statement, recognizing that this dictum, though it appeared to answer the creationist on a philosophical level, could not usefully be translated into everyday experience, for this is to attack belief at its very roots, to tear up the entire foundation on which the maintenance of life is built. If you did not dare trust your senses so as to keep clear of precipices and other such things to be avoided and make for their opposites, there would be a speedy end to life itself. But such sophistry was to cut no ice at all with the Stoic Cicero. It smacked too much of that special pleading for which Cicero, as an advocate in law, had little patience. For if our reasoning powers could be trusted to interpret what our senses were telling us on a day-to-day basis when it came to such vital matters as personal safety and survival, then they could surely be trusted to interpret less vital phenomena, such as evidence from design in the universe around us, which spoke so eloquently and forcefully of the universe having been created by an infinite and omnipotent intelligence. As a creationist, the Stoic Cicero simply could not appreciate the Epicurean viewpoint of Lucretius. In the heavens, there is nothing accidental, nothing arbitrary, nothing out of order, nothing erratic. Everywhere is order, truth, reason, consistency. I cannot understand this regularity in the stars, this harmony of time and motion in their various orbits through all eternity, except as the expression of reason, mind, and purpose. Their constant and eternal motion, wonderful and mysterious in its regularity, declares the indwelling power of a divine intelligence. If any man cannot feel the power of God when he looks upon the stars, then I doubt whether he is capable of any feeling at all. To Cicero's mind, it was the greatest irony that a thinker like Lucretius, who bleated most about his unshakable faith in the innate powers of matter to create itself and arrange itself into a meaningful and purposeful order without any outside aid or influence, found himself unable to trust that the same matter when it came to perceiving or even explaining this fact. In matters not, it matters not, it seems, how eloquently one may fulminate against creationism, charging it with every superstition under the sun, if one then declares that the reasoning powers of him who so fulminates cannot be trusted. Whether expressed in ancient times or in modern, it is still a case of shooting oneself in the philosophical foot, and it has effectually disarmed the materialist cause at every turn. It bedeviled the 18th century Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, whose philosophy in a nutshell stated that it was only reasonable to believe in God. But as we know that God does not exist, then our reasoning powers cannot be trusted. What Hume, along with every other materialist philosopher, was really trying to say, of course, was that no one's reasoning powers could be trusted but his own, thus making himself the only sure point of reference in the universe. But such was the philosophical mess into which this led him that Kant, the inheritor of Hume's mantle, once painfully lamented the fact that it remains a scandal to philosophy and to human reason in general that the existence of things outside us must be accepted merely on faith, and that if anyone thinks good to doubt their existence, we are unable to counter his doubts by any satisfactory proof. No creationist could have expressed the materialist dilemma more concisely, and Kant has highlighted the phenomenon that has not only ensured throughout history that creationism would always hold the higher ground when it came to the expression of simple logic, but which also led out of sheer frustration to the birth of rigors of empiricist school of thought in the 1920s. But there is another element in the controversy that has also persisted down the ages concerning the part that chance might be played in the successful arrangement of matter, whether animate or inanimate. The pagan Greeks had taken the argument down to the atomic level and insisted of the desperately sought after simplicity of arrangement that was so necessary to the materialist cause. They found only a greater and more mind boggling complexity, which again only added to their difficulties in attempting to explain the allegedly accidental creation and mindless existence of the universe. Again, we turn to Cicero for a judgment on the scene. It is not a wonder that anyone can bring himself to believe that a number of solid and separate particles, by their chance collisions and moved only by the force of their own weight, could bring into being so marvelous and beautiful a world. If anybody thinks that this is possible, I do not see why he should not think that if an infinite number of examples of the 21 letters of the alphabet made of gold, or what you will, were shaken together and poured out on the ground, it would be possible for them to fall so as to spell out, say, the whole text of the Annuals of Aeneas. In fact, I doubt whether chance would permit them to spell out a single verse. Now, where have we heard that analogy before? This argument, which was the Roman equivalent of today's monkeys and typewriters tapping out the works of Shakespeare, has endured simply because it has always proved to be unanswerable by the materialist in any but the most strained and unlikely terms. Though even this argument was hardly new to Cicero's day, but seems to have been merely part and parcel of an already ancient creation and armory of vexing philosophical questions that the materialist could never satisfactorily answer. The Epicurean school, through Lucretius, did attempt to wreak a vengeance of sorts, for Lucretius went on to specify an idea that threatened to provide a stumbling block to classical, i.e., pagan, creationism, conceding the fact that the materialist perception of the universe was marred somewhat by the alleged inability of human reason to perceive correctly the nature of the philosophical universe. Lucretius claimed that creationism likewise had a chink in its philosophical armor when it came to explaining the Earth's place in the universe. The classical perception of the universe amongst the Greeks was that it was geocentric, the stars, planets, and everything else revolving around a fixed and immovable Earth. And Lucretius assumed wrongly that this was crucial to the creationist view. It gave a fixed point of reference to the universe, and it was a philosophical concept that allowed the teaching of absolute values. Lucretius, therefore, attempted to introduce a more relativistic framework by claiming that the earth was not fixed at all, but moved in an infinite space that possessed no center. This was to counter the Stoics' view of a finite universe whose outer bounds were equidistant from the earth. It is a matter of observation that one thing is limited by another. The hills are demarcated by air, and air by the hills. Land sets bounds to sea, and sea to every land, but the universe has nothing outside to limit it. Shrewdly going on to make his point that there can be no center in infinity. With these ludicrously, ludicrously simple statements, Lucretius had put forward an idea that was truly revolutionary, before which he has received scant acknowledgement from historians of any hue. He did not develop the idea into that of a strictly heliocentric universe, as Copernicus was later to do, but he did depart radically even from the view of his materialist colleagues, for they too held that the Earth was fixed and the universe revolved around it. Lucretius had hoped to rob the creationist camp of the finest weapon in its armory, the argument for an ordered and hence designed universe, by introducing the concept of randomness, aimlessness, and sheer relativism. But he was disappointed, for even his materialist peers were unable to follow him down that particular path. Ironically, this had nothing to do with the fact that the Greeks and Romans of the time were ignorant in any way. On the contrary, they were great observers, and the virtue of the geocentric model lay in the fact that it compiled with all the observed facts of contemporary science. Indeed, few theories in the history of science have ever enjoyed such overwhelming and indisputable proofs as those which once graced geocentrism, and that in this present age that virtually worships the concept of empiricism has to be one of the greatest ironies of all. To add to the irony, and contrary to all expectations from the materialist camp, when the Copernican revolution finally did arrive in the 16th century, it did not mean the end of creationism, for a very good and simple reason. In creationist terms, it matters not a jot whether the earth revolves around the sun or the sun around the earth. For whichever model of the universe is the correct one, the question still remains: who created it? Who did it come How did it come into existence, and whence came its astonishing degree of order and complexity? These are the questions that have been asked by men since the beginning of time, and one of them, named Lucilius, had worked out the answer for himself without any help from either Christian or Jew. Attributed the design, creation, and maintenance of the universe to that creator who is, as Enos says, the Father both of gods and men, at a present and a mighty God. If anyone doubts this, then so far as I can see, he might just as well doubt the existence of the Son, for the one is as plain as the other. And if this were not clearly known and manifest to our intelligence, the faith of men would not have remained so constant, would not have deepened with the lapse of time, and taken ever firmer root throughout the ages and the generations of mankind. It is Lucilius's generations of mankind that now must occupy our attention. For with his profound statement, this chapter must draw to a close. But Lucilius was referring to is the fact that alongside even the very worst aspect of paganism in the ancient world, there was preserved a definite knowledge of God. The value of this lies in the fact that this knowledge existed and still exists quite independently of Genesis amidst cultures that were and are entirely antagonistic towards the concept of one God, the creator of all things. We shall now encounter this same knowledge in the early genealogies and historical records of the early pagan nations, and note that their testimony is unexpected to say the least when we consider what the modernist school has been claiming all these years.